All right, so today we're talking about the first part in how did British imperialism develop in India. So basically, how did India go from being one of the most powerful countries in the world to being controlled by Britain? So if we look here on this map, this is the world in 1600, and you could see some of the major empires and trade routes of the world. And today we're really going to start focusing on imperialism, which is different than colonialism, which is something we're going to have gone over in class itself. So the first question is, how did the British East India Company gain control of India? Now, first off, just to kind of make your life a little bit easier, when you're taking your notes, you could just abbreviate British East India Company, because otherwise you'll be writing it out 25,000 times. But the British East India Company was a joint stock company. And what a joint stock company means is that you have a bunch of people that own shares, stock in the company itself, and they kind of pool their money together, and they use that money to be able to make large investments. So what was going on in India during this time period is India was kind of when we're talking about the British taking over India, we're talking about the 1700s, the 18th century. And what was going on in India is India, which was being controlled by the Mughal dynasty. You should remember this, hopefully, from Miss Canone. So the Mughal dynasty was one of what we call the gunpowder empires. And so the Mughal dynasty at one point had been this amazing, powerful country under the control of people like Akbar the Great. But Akbar the Great was around in like the 1500s, the 16th century. And what Akbar was very good at was bringing together the Hindu and the Muslim and all the various different competing groups in India and kind of bringing them all together and making everybody work together. Because if you remember, India really was not a united country. It pretty much was a series of separate kingdoms with only brief moments of it being united. Those brief moments being the Mauryans, the Guptas, and then the Mughals. But the Mauryans and the Guptas, that's way back because the Guptas are contemporaries with the Romans. And so from the Guptas, really up to the Mughals, which start in about the 1400s, India is not a united country. Like I said, it's a series of separate kingdoms and city-states. So when the Mughals controlled India, it still was a series of separate city-states and kingdoms, each ruled by what was called a Raj or a prince. So what this did, though, is this gave a little bit of an advantage to the British. Now, in India, like I said before, was being ruled by the Mughal Empire, but by this point, the Mughal Empire was what we would call a empire that's beginning to fail. It's a weakening empire because you have a series of bad rulers, and those rulers are starting to elevate the Muslims because the Mughals are a Muslim empire. They're starting to elevate the Muslims and persecute the Hindus, and a lot of the Rajas or the princes were Hindu, and they began to start fighting back, which gave a really good opportunity to the British because now Britain is a little tiny itty-bitty country. India is a huge, massive country. But because India, like I said before, was really a series of separate city-states, or separate kingdoms, what the British were able to do was to come in as the empire was starting to break apart and do what we call divide and conquer. So what they were able to do was kind of pit the different groups against each other. And by pitting the different groups against each other, it made it very easy for the for the British to come in and take over. And that's what the British did. They kind of stirred up problems that were already kind of there within India. And here you can see, this is an image of a coffee house in British India. So British rule in India is sometimes referred to as the British Raj, again, since Raj means prince. So that's why sometimes the rule in India, the rule of the British in India would be referred to as the British Raj. Now, the rise of this actually came from a couple of reasons. First off, it came off between the rivalry between the British and the French. And if you remember the 7 Years' War in the 18th century, It was a major war, also the French and Indian War in North America, in which the British and the French were fighting against each other. The British and the French were on opposite sides of 5 major wars in the 18th century. They fought all across the world, and most of these wars ended in British victories. So with the 7 Years' War, the British were able to push out the French, any claims that the French had to trading posts in India. The British were ultimately able to push them out, and that really set the stage for Britain to be able to begin to take over India. So the first British victories over the French and over the Indian princes came in the southern part of the Indian subcontinent in the late 1740s. And then when they really began to come into their own and begin to gain a large deal of power, was their victories in Bengal. Now, Bengal today is Bangladesh. So I'll show you here. This is a map of India in the mid-18th century, and you could see everything that's in this kind of like red outline here. This is all the area that was controlled by the British by the mid-18th century, and all of these areas here were still under Hindu control, like this area here, and then there were certain other areas that the British didn't quite gain control of as of yet. But this is the region that's referred to as Bengal. Like I said, today most of it, at least this section over here, today is Bangladesh. Calcutta was a city that was founded by the British. That today is still in India. Now, the major thing that happens, the major thing that allows the British to gain control of Bengal is something known as the Battle of Plassey. And I'll show you. So the Battle of Plassey, which happens in 1757. Now, in the Battle of Plassey, excuse me, we have 3,000 British troops fighting with also what are known as sepoys. And this is a sepoy. A sepoy is an Indian soldier for hire who works for the British. And the sepoys are pretty much, oh, sorry, I thought I had a pen here. I'm moving stuff around. Are pretty much the policemen of what's going to eventually become the British Empire. Without the sepoys, the British would not be able to have gained control of India, and they would not have been able to gain control of other lands that they're eventually going to take over, because the sepoys really helped kind of add numbers to their armies, because remember, the British, again, Britain is not a very big country. Population, as opposed to something like India, is much, much lower. So without these hired soldiers, India never would have, Britain would have never had a chance in taking over all of these other lands. So in 1757, we have 3,000 British troops and sepoys managing to defeat the Bengal army of about 50,000. And so this was a pretty significant victory for the British, and it allowed the British to take over, again, this region. Why is this not going? Sorry. The region of what's known as Bengal, which was considered like the breadbasket of India. So Bengal is where, again, northeast corner of India, and Bengal was, like I said, like a breadbasket. It was very fertile. It's at the mouth of the Brahmaputra River. Let me actually do it in blue. This is the Brahmaputra River, which comes down here. It kind of swings back around the Himalayas and comes in here. It's also where I don't know if I can see, the Ganges River meets, and this right here is one of the largest river deltas in the world. It is one of the most fertile areas of land in the world. Now, what led to this amazing British victory, 3,000 to 50,000, there was a couple of reasons why. Now, the leader of Bengal, or what was referred to as the Nawab, that was the term for leader, or king, I guess you could say, in India. So you can see this is a picture of the palace of the Nawab in Bengal. This is in 1858. So the Nawab at the time of the Battle of Plassey his name was, I'll write it out for you because I am not going to be able to pronounce it, and if I do, I'm just going to massacre the name. horribly. And he was essentially a teenager. So Siraj-ud-Dowlah, I believe, he was essentially a teenager. So he is a teenager trying to fight against Robert Clive, who was an architect of Britain's other victories in other parts of India. So Sir Robert Clive, which I showed you here, this guy here, Sir Robert Clive, he was kind of the architect of Britain's other victories in the south. And he wanted to gain control, like again, of this very fertile and populous Bengal kingdom. And so what Clive did is he had really well-paid Indian spies. So he had spies all throughout the Nawab's court, and that was giving him all sorts of accounts of what was going on in Siraj-ud-Dowlah's ranks and kind of like the infighting that was going on. The other thing that he did is because the Bengalis were Muslim, and there's this Muslim-Hindu conflict that kind of is always kind of under the surface in India. A lot of the Hindu bankers were giving Clive a ton of money. And this is where this whole divide and conquer thing comes in. Because Clive was able to capitalize on this conflict that was already there. A lot of the Hindu business leaders and business bankers that didn't like the Muslim Nawab, they were giving money to Clive. And that was where Clive was getting all the money to pay off all of these spies. So, and they wanted to get back at him for a lot of unpaid debts. So Clive actually wound up buying off the Nawab's chief general and all of the key allies. The Nawab also had spies in Clive's ranks and amongst the sepoys, but Clive found out who they were. He paid them even more money, and he got them on his side. Now, the other major issue was, we go back to the sepoys. Why are so many Indians willing to work for the British and fight for the British? And one of the reasons why is they were very well paid. It was a well-paid position to be a sepoy. Meanwhile, the Nawab's troops were not well paid, and so that was another advantage for Robert Clive. So the battle begins June 23rd, 1757. And basically it had already been lost for the Nawab because pretty much almost the whole army defects to the British or they refused to fight. And so what the British were able to do at that point was to take direct control over Bengal and take control of this very, very fertile area. So if we look at this map, this is a map of India, 18th century to early 19th century, and we can kind of see the progression of the British. So everything in this kind of purpley color here, this is the British possessions until 1858. So by 1858, you see they've gained all these large portions here in southern India, Bengal, parts of what today are Myanmar and other Burma, which is Myanmar. So other countries in Southeast Asia. They've gained what's referred to as the Punjab up here in northwest India, central parts of India. They gained these areas here after 1858 in kind of this darker color. And then the lighter colors, these areas here were all still Indian states, Rajput states. So these areas were all still controlled by Indian princes. However, they were the British were controlling them. So they let the British let the Indian princes continue to govern, but they were pretty much listening to the British. And you could see there's still some random places here where the French had possessions, but nothing of any true significance. Another thing I just want to point out to you again, you see how the Ganges River here and the Brahmaputra River here and all these different lines here, this is why Bengal was so desirable to the British, because of this large river delta that was there, making it very, very fertile. So the British used a lot of kind of sneaky tactics in order to gain control of India and make India an important colony for the British. The British actually refer to India as the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. So this picture here, I just want to go through this really quickly. These are all a lot of the major British viceroys of India. And one I just wanted to point out to you, you might recognize the name if you remember anything about American history, Lord Cornwallis. Lord Cornwallis is the man who surrendered to Washington's forces at the Battle of Yorktown ending the Revolutionary War and getting the British out of America. And after that time there, Lord Cornwallis went on to become Viceroy of India. So it's kind of interesting little tidbit of information. And so here we can see these are some of the Maharajas, which are the Indian princes, which still ruled over their various different areas of India. However, India was still, they were still kind of listening to the British and basically essentially under the control of the British. So that's essentially how the British were able to gain control over India. The next video we're going to talk about is how did the British actually rule over India. So I'm going to stop here, and I'll see you all in class.